It appears as though a lot of today's Western culture seems self-loathing, blaming itself for past societal wrongs such as slavery. Now, we speak of white privilege and observe people groups blaming others for their own lack of success. Joining me now to talk about this from Calgary is Mark Milke, a public policy analyst and author of The Victim Cult, How the Culture of Blame Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. Mark, it's a fascinating book. In a nutshell, how does the past really hurt or wreck civilizations?
Well, you can learn the wrong lessons from the past is the problem, right? So, for example, Bill Clinton, just after the 9/11 attacks, said, look, part of the reason the 9/11 attacks happened was due to the Crusades 1,000 years before. To say this was a stretch understates it massively. What Clinton didn't understand and didn't know, actually, is that the Muslim world forgot entirely about the Crusades until the 1860s, when Europeans brought it up in a way to try and say, you know, this is a result, colonialism is bad, here's an example of it. So actually, the Muslim world forgot about it for 8.5 centuries until Europeans brought it back to life, ironically enough. And to blame something on the past is a problem often, not always, but often a problem because you may miss out on the real reason you or someone else has a problem. And in fact, sometimes it gives people a reason to escape their own responsibility. And that's problematic as well individually. But the victim cult is really about that. It's about, imagine, we all know someone who thinks like a victim, rightly or wrongly. Maybe they were a victim, maybe they weren't. But multiply that by millions of people when you have entire societies stuck kind of in a grievance narrative, as I call it in the victim cult, then you've got a real problem because they're not looking to improve themselves or really look for what causes current problems. And that's a big problem with grievance narratives.
So what really motivated you to write the book? Did you experience a lot of wrongs yourself in the past?
Well, I mean, everybody has those examples in their own lives, or you look at your parents, right? My parents had a tough time in the 1980s in Kelowna, where I grew up, right? Bank of Canada interest rates shot up to 20%. My parents lost their house and they never really recovered financially. So everyone has something in their past, or, you know, their family's past or their friends. There's no shortage of actual victimization, and I don't downplay that in the victim cult. But the book started 8 years ago with an observation. I'd done a lot of policy work on Native issues in Canada, on First Nations, and I noticed a big difference between those reserves that were successful and those that were not. And a lot of it had to do with some First Nations leaders, and I emphasize only some, but some First Nations leaders who always look back to the past and always blame current circumstances on the past. They go back 50 years or 100 years or 200 years. Now, the problem with that is you miss out on real reasons why something is wrong today. So let me give you a clear example. We know, for example, that Aboriginal Canadians on average earn less than other Canadians, but that doesn't really get into the details and show you where people succeed. So, for example, if you look at young adults that are ages 25 to 34, it doesn't matter whether you're Aboriginal or any other Canadian. And if you got a university degree, for example, you earn almost the exact same, and in some cases higher. The higher you go in the educational ladder. An Aboriginal Canadian will actually earn, on average, higher than other Canadians if you've got a post-secondary degree, something beyond rather bachelor's. So why are Aboriginal Canadians on average poorer than other Canadians? It has a lot to do with geography. Reserves are often in the middle of nowhere. There's no educational opportunities, or very few, right, beyond high school. And the geography also limits the ability to earn an income. If your reserve is a fly-in reserve in northern Manitoba, you're not going to have the economic opportunities other Canadians do. In other words, don't blame 100 years ago on today, blame geography, blame education. Now, the good thing about that, the positive thing for Aboriginal Canadians, is you can move, you can get an education. Those are correctable, right? You may need to move from a remote location like any other Canadian, right? So these things are not set in stone. And so I think it's a real mistake to concentrate, as bad as some things that have been in the past. I think it's a real mistake to concentrate on the past, to almost obsessively so. And this is a problem with victim cults. When you obsess on the past, you may miss out on the real reasons why you or your society, whoever it is, beyond Aboriginal Canadians. My book takes a look at 1,000 years of history. Anyone, if you obsess on the past, you may miss out the real reason why you succeed or don't succeed today.
What about people who use the victim card as a tool of sorts? It's like, your ancestors did this to my ancestors, so now you owe me.
Yeah. There's a good example in the victim cult. I go into a lot of history. There's some Canadian examples, but let me give you one example from history that I think most people are familiar with, or at least the later years. Most people are familiar with Germany after 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. And even in the 1920s, where Germans blamed their problems on how World War I ended, the Weimar Treaty, the Versailles Treaty, and responses by the Allies to the Germans. There was a lot of blame going on after the First World War in Germany itself, blaming the Allies, blaming others. And this actually led to the possibility for Adolf Hitler to rise to power in 1933 and the Nazis on kind of a narrative of blame, surfing blame, you could say, into power. What most people are not aware of is it didn't start in 1933, and it didn't start with the end of the First World War. It didn't start in the 1920s. Germans blamed others for more than a century. Germany was originally occupied in the late 17th century by France, southern and western Germany. And when the Germans finally ejected the French from German territories in the early 1800s, they rightly blamed some of their problems on the French. The French were quite brutal to Germans, right? I mean, it was war and all the atrocities you can imagine, war from rape to pillage to just stealing of property occurred. I mean, it was an awful time for Germans who had been occupied by the French for the most part. Now, the problem was that even after Germans ejected the French from German soil, Germans became, I don't know how else to describe it, paranoid, conspiratorial. They thought of themselves as permanent victims. So they thought of themselves not only as victims of the French, which they had been, but they started to look around and think, okay, now that we're a country again, or we're kind of a contiguous territory, how do we make Germany great again? There's no other way to put it. Well, they lapsed into notions of pure culture. And this excluded a lot of people. If you weren't Protestant, if you weren't born in Germany, you could never be a true German in their view. And they blamed not only the French, but they blamed Jews, of course. This started early on in the 1800s. And they went from kind of a religious anti-Semitism to really a philosophical anti-Semitism. Germans didn't like the English. They didn't like capitalism. They didn't like British liberalism. So there's a whole host of people and ideas that Germans were afraid of, that they thought were bad influences. And they became paranoid about contamination of true Germanhood. And this went on for a century, more than a century, before actually they got into, about half a century before they got into racial theories about purity as well, which just made it all that much worse.
You know, I think there's a place for governments to apologize for past wrongs, but should there be an end to it at some point in time? Our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has made a lot of apologies for past societal wrongs, but should we forgive and move on at some point in time?
Well, I'm conflicted on this, and I think you have to be very specific about what you're apologizing for. I'm not sure that actually politicians apologizing do much to add to the stock of human compassion. I could be wrong, but I think, look, by the time a politician apologizes for something on behalf of the country, it may be that the country has already moved on. I mean, by the time you apologize for what we did to Japanese Canadians in the 1980s, for example, when Prime Minister Brian Mulroney apologized for that, I think almost every Canadian would think putting the Japanese Canadians in internment camps in World War II was an awful injustice, a tragedy, a willful tragedy by politicians and others of the day. But nonetheless, I mean, the real work here is actually in the details. So, for example, there was some compensation to Japanese Canadians in the 1950s, but not really enough to make up for the property that we'd stolen from them, the government stole from them in the 1940s. It was only really a partial compensation. So if you're going to apologize, I think it has to be, and attribute blame, I think it has to be very tight, very direct. So, for example, you've been hurt or harmed by the government. I mean, we do this every day. If government takes your property, expropriates your property, you can go to court and say, I want my money for that property. Or generally, governments in advance of that will pay you out for your property. But if they do something unjust, you can go to the courts and sue them. So I think if it's you or maybe your parents, but the further you go back, the more difficult it becomes to say, you owe me, right? Or your ancestors owe me, and somehow your ancestors are my ancestors, and thus you owe me. So a good example of this is it's a debate in the U.S. right now. Should there be compensation for slavery, which ended in 1865 at the end of the Civil War? I think that's a stretch for a whole bunch of reasons that I point out in the victim cult. I think that really goes way beyond what I call a reasonable statute of limitations.
You also have a chapter that explains how the evangelical Christians led the charge to abolish slavery. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, and I put this chapter in the victim cult because, again, if we're gonna have debates about your ancestors harmed my ancestors, and we all owe each other somehow, that becomes really complicated, difficult to sort out. It's difficult enough today to sort out in a courtroom, right? When you're alleged to have done wrong, I mean, faulty memories, witnesses have different accounts. It's difficult enough in the modern day to sort through who's right or wrong or who's to blame or who should be convicted in a courtroom, never mind going back 150 years. But if we're going to play this game, let's at least try and weigh both sides of the scale, right? So, for example, these days it's popular to beat up on British imperialists, right? British colonialists. Now, look, no empire is perfect, no country is perfect, no person is perfect. Once you grasp that or admit that, then you have to go, okay, in addition to, some bad things the British Empire did, I mean, nobody likes to be occupied by an empire. The fact is, it was the British imperialists and it was evangelical Christians in specific in that empire, whether in Great Britain itself or in Canada or the northern United States. They're the ones who came up with the idea that slavery happens to be wrong. It happens to be an injury to human beings who are made in the image of God. That was what Christian evangelicals thought, and they acted on that belief, and they fought against the current, not only of their time, but of all of human history where slavery had not been opposed, really, by other than a few maybe philosophers in ancient Greece. So it was a remarkable, courageous stand that evangelicals began to take in the late 18th century. William Wilberforce, a lot of your viewers will be familiar with that name, the Christian evangelical parliamentarian in Great Britain, who began in the 1780s to oppose slavery, root and branch, and he spent his entire political career, decades, fighting slavery. And of course, the British Empire was the first to abolish slavery domestically among European countries, and then to abolish it in the Empire of 1833, 32 years before the Americans did. There's an unknown history in Canada where some of our colonial governors in the late 1700s take a cue from William Wilberforce and oppose slavery in the Atlantic colonies, in Upper Canada, in Lower Canada. They took their cue from William Wilberforce, and by the time slavery was outlawed in 1833 across the empire, i.e. including Canada, Canadians didn't pay any compensation to slaves because for the most part, it was done with in Canada a couple of decades before.
Mark, Asian Canadians and Americans also experienced discrimination. But interestingly, this people group had an amazing success compared to other people groups. What did they do that was so different?
Right. I wanted to, in the victim cult, not only look again at the problem of victimhood, I wanted to study those who were victimized and then how they responded, right? How did they avoid getting stuck? Because again, in the victim cult, I don't deny that victimization happens in history or now. So the question is, what do you do about it? Well, the good example comes from East Asian arrivals to the Pacific coast, both Canada and the United States, starting around 1850. In the case of the United States, around the time of the gold rush in California, massive immigration by the Chinese, 2 or 3 decades later by the Japanese. In both cases, heavily discriminated against in the United States as they were in Canada. Couldn't hold certain professions, couldn't get citizenship. This lasts for over a century in various forms, that kind of institutional discrimination against Chinese, Canadians, and Americans and the Japanese as well, including native-born Japanese and Chinese in the United States and Canada. All right, so what did they do then? Well, for one thing, they didn't make the mistake of saying we're only victims, there's nothing we could do. That's really debilitating. If you're always blaming someone else and saying, I'm only what you say I am, that actually is really harmful to you and you as a society and your community, your tribe, so to speak. Asian Canadians and Asian Americans fought back. They didn't accept the treatment as much as they could. There's some great stories about how early Chinese Americans go all the way to the Supreme Court to get what rights they could, and in some cases succeed. There's a wonderful example of a Chinese American who writes to the governor of California and says, America is only for whites. And this Chinese American writes to the governor, John Engler, and says, this is false in the extreme, and you know it. And it was a very articulate letter in response to the governor of California, saying, we Chinese Americans are every bit as worthy of citizenship as you with white skin. So they fought back. They also did some other interesting things. Purposefully or just as part of the cultural response, Chinese and Japanese, Canadians, and Americans always placed a high emphasis in education. So one of the fascinating things I discovered in research for the victim cult was by 1920 and by 1930, Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, their children are graduating at rates higher than white Americans from high school and from college. And why does this matter? Because it set the foundations right then and beyond for the future success of Asian Americans. And the same thing happened in Canada, but the statistics were there for the United States for the most part. And you see that really provides a foundation for Asian American success and Asian Canadian success.
Mark Milke, author of The Victim Cult, thanks for joining me from Calgary today.
Thank you, Hal.
And on behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.